Someone did something for you, without asking for anything in return, or at least that is how it appeared. There is a transaction that happens with every favor you receive, a transaction that was not declared, not negotiated, often not even conscious for the one who initiated it, but it exists, and it will be collected, not necessarily in bad faith, not necessarily with cruelty, but with the inevitability of a physical law. Reciprocity, the human tendency to feel obligated to repay what was received, is one of the oldest, deepest, and most universal mechanisms of human social behavior, and like every powerful mechanism, can be used to connect or to control. Think about the last time someone did something for you that you did not ask for, an unsolicited favor, a gift that arrived at a specific moment, help that appeared exactly when you were vulnerable. How did you feel afterward? Grateful. That is natural. But there is something beyond gratitude, a subtle sense that you now owe something, that there is an open debt, that the next time this person needs something from you, refusing will cost something beyond the situation itself. This is not paranoia. This is not ingratitude. It is the reciprocity mechanism operating exactly as designed. The problem is not the mechanism. It is that you were never taught to distinguish between those who use this mechanism to create genuine connection and those who use it to create debt. To understand why favors create power over you, you need to understand why reciprocity is impossible to turn off, not a cultural choice, not a social convention you can simply ignore. It is biology. Marshall Sahlins, Cultural Universal. Anthropologist Marshall Sahlins documented something no known human culture contradicts. Reciprocity, in some form, exists in every recorded human society, without exception. Groups where reciprocity worked, where favors were repaid, where cooperation was maintained through mutual obligations, survived better than groups where it did not. Reciprocity was not taught, it was selected. Robert Cialdini, the most exploited trigger. Psychologist Robert Cialdini, whose work on influence became the central reference in persuasion psychology, identified reciprocity as the first and most powerful of the influenza triggers. His research demonstrated something disturbing in its precision. Reciprocity operates regardless of whether you wanted what you received. In classic experiments, people who received an unsolicited gift, even a small gift, even a gift they did not want, felt measurable obligation to repay, not in proportion to the value of what they received, in proportion to the act of having received. The asymmetry of reciprocity. There is something in the mechanics of reciprocity that is rarely named, and is the point where it becomes most exploitable. Reciprocity is asymmetrical. The discomfort of an unrepaid debt is consistently greater than the pleasure of an uncollected credit. This means that the giver has less psychological urgency than the receiver. The giver can wait, cannot explicitly collect, can simply let the discomfort of debt work for them. And the receiver, who is feeling the weight of obligation, often takes initiative to repay before being asked, often in greater proportion than the original favor, often in ways they would not have chosen if they had had time to process. Researcher Dennis Regan at Cornell demonstrated this empirically. People who received a small unsolicited gift from a stranger subsequently bought significantly more products from that stranger, in quantities far exceeding the value of the gift received. They were not asked to buy, not pressured. The gift created the pressure. The cultural reinforcement. In practically every culture, the person who does not repay favors is labeled ungrateful, selfish, taking advantage of others, taking and not giving. And these labels, which have real social consequences in terms of exclusion and reputation, function as punishment for non-repayment. The system is calibrated to ensure you repay, biologically, culturally. And those who understand how this system works can position favors to create obligations you will feel compelled to honor before processing whether you even want to. The colleague. A colleague helps you with a project at a difficult time. You did not ask. They showed up, offered, delivered. You feel genuine gratitude. That is real. 3 weeks later, They ask you to cover a commitment that will cost you significant time and is outside your scope. You feel the tension, not between wanting to help or not, between the obligation the previous help created and the real cost of what is being asked now. And in most cases, you will say yes, not because you decided you want to, because the debt created 3 weeks ago is being collected now. The problem was not the request. The problem was when the favor arrived. Unsolicited, at a moment of vulnerability, in proportion calculated to create enough obligation for the request that would come later. The favor was the investment, the request was the return. And you never realized you were participating in a transaction. In 44 BC, Marcus Tullius Cicero wrote something that remains one of the most precise analyses of social power ever produced. No duty is more urgent than repaying gratitude. Cicero was not making a moral observation. He was describing a law of the Roman social system, a system where favors, debts, and obligations were the real currency of power, not gold obligations. The Roman patronage system, which governed power relations for centuries, was fundamentally an economy of favors. The patron protected, financed, opened doors. The client repaid with loyalty, votes, presence, information, work. The favor was never free. It was a calculated investment in a system where repayment was guaranteed by the same force that guaranteed any other transaction. Social pressure of reciprocity. And those who accumulated more obligations, who had done more favors not yet repaid, had more power. Not declared power, implicit power. The power of someone with credits to collect. Machiavelli, the modern analysis. Machiavelli observed 15 centuries after Cicero that the prince's power did not depend only on military force or economic resources. It depended on a network of obligations. The prince who relies on the favors he has distributed has a more solid foundation than the prince who relies only on fear. Not because favors are kinder than fear, but because favors create a debt that the debtor feels as their own, as a moral obligation, as a debt of honor. Force can be contested. Moral debt rarely is. The 3 types of givers. Adam Grant. Researcher Adam Grant at Wharton School developed a typology in give and take that directly applies to what we are discussing. Grant identified 3 types of givers. The genuine giver, who gives without expectation of return, operates by values. When they cannot give, they say they cannot. The matcher, who gives in proportion to what they receive, maintains conscious balance, does not give more than they expect to receive, but does not collect more than they gave. The taker disguised as a giver, who gives strategically, selects who receives their favors based on expected return, accumulates obligations systematically, and collects at the moment of greatest advantage for themselves. Grant demonstrated that in the long term, genuine givers are the most successful because they build networks of real loyalty. But in the short term, takers disguised as givers often have more influence because they have created a network of obligations that produces real behavior. And the distinction between the 3 types is not in the giving behavior. It is in the behavior when collection time arrives. There is one indicator more reliable than any other to distinguish generosity from investment. Timing. Genuine favors arrive when they arrive, without calculation about when you are most vulnerable, without relation to decisions you are about to make. Instrumental favors arrive at specific moments, when you are under pressure and need help, and therefore in an emotional state that amplifies gratitude and the sense of obligation. When you are about to make a decision that affects the person, and the favor arrives immediately before, calibrating your disposition. When an opportunity to ask is near, and the favor arrives as preparation for the request. The favor that arrives exactly when you are most vulnerable is not necessarily generosity. It may be strategic precision. Seneca wrote, in the 1st century AD, beneficia usque eoleata sunt dum reduntur. Favors are joyful only while they are being repaid. In a genuine favor, repayment is freely chosen. In an instrumental favor, repayment is the point from the beginning. The favor arrived. The obligation was created. The question now, will you honor a debt you consciously chose to assume, or one placed on you without your knowledge? Just as in the script on betrayal, we need to go to a place most analyses of manipulation avoid. Not just how instrumental favors work, but why they work on you specifically. Because the reciprocity mechanism is universal. It is in everyone, but the intensity with which it operates, the ease with which it can be activated as a lever, varies enormously between people. And understanding what increases your vulnerability to this specific lever is what transforms knowledge from interesting information into real protection. Vulnerability 1. The person who cannot refuse the favor. There is a specific profile disproportionately susceptible to manipulation via reciprocity. The person who feels that refusing a favor, saying, "Thank you, but I do not need it," is a form of rejecting the giver. For this person, accepting the favor is not just a practical choice about whether they need what is being offered. It is a social act that preserves the bond. Researcher Harriet Lerner identified this pattern in her analysis of codependent relationships. The person who cannot refuse favors is often operating from a belief system where letting someone do something for me is equivalent to confirming I care about this person. And within that system, refusing the favor is equivalent to rejecting the person, which is exactly what the instrumental giver counts on you feeling. Because if you cannot refuse, you have no way to evaluate the favor before accepting it. And if you cannot evaluate before accepting, the obligation is already created by the time you realize what was given. Vulnerability 2. The pride of being the giver and the guilt of being the receiver. This is the most subtle pattern, and the one that creates the greatest vulnerability. There is a type of person who has a deeply asymmetrical relationship with giving and receiving. Giving is easy, is natural, is who they believe themselves to be. Receiving is uncomfortable, creates a sense of debt more intense than average. Activate is something that feels like guilt. This person, who is often the most generous person around them, is paradoxically the most vulnerable to manipulation via reciprocity. Why? Because the discomfort with debt is so intense that they will repay quickly, generously, and often in excess. Not because they calculated it as fair, but because they need to resolve the discomfort of the obligation. And the instrumental giver knows this. Knows that a favor given to this person will be repaid with interest. Not because they are lenient, but because being a bearer of unrepaid debt is entirely incompatible with the identity they have built for themselves. Jung would say that the pride of being the giver, taken to the extreme, becomes a form of control, of maintaining a position of moral superiority through generosity. And the shadow of that pride is exactly this vulnerability. The difficulty of receiving without feeling you lost something. The difficulty of being in debt without feeling it compromises who you are. Vulnerability 3. Gratitude as anesthetic. Genuine gratitude, the emotional state that emerges when someone does something that helps us, has a specific neurological effect. Researcher Robert Emmons at UC Davis demonstrated that gratitude states activate the brain's reward system, specifically dopamine and serotonin circuits. In plain language, gratitude produces a genuinely good feeling, and positive emotional states reduce critical analytical thinking. This means that at the moment you are most grateful, which is the moment immediately after receiving a favor, you are in the cognitive state least suited to evaluate whether the favor was genuine or instrumental. Gratitude anesthetizes analysis, and those who understand this mechanism use the timing of the favor to ensure you are at the peak of gratitude and the valley of critical analysis at the moment the obligation is being created. Vulnerability 4. The inability to tolerate unresolved social debt. The discomfort of unresolved social debt is not equal for everyone. For some people, an unrepaid obligation is a tolerable background noise, something that exists, is acknowledged, but does not govern behavior urgently. For other people, an unrepaid obligation is an unbearable state. a source of anxiety that is not resolved until the debt is honored. And this second category of people will do things they did not plan, yield on points they did not want to yield, say yes to requests they wanted to refuse, simply to resolve the discomfort of the debt. Jung would call this pattern reciprocity compulsion, a behavior that appears to be choice-beautiful, an automatic response to an internal discomfort the person does not know how to tolerate otherwise. And the root of this pattern, as almost always in Jung, lies in something learned early. Environments where not repaying had serious relational consequences. Families where favors were not given, they were invested, and collection was certain. Cultures where the obligation of reciprocity was used as a mechanism of generational control. The adult who grew up in that environment carries a nervous system calibrated to feel social debt with an intensity the current situation rarely justifies. Naming these vulnerabilities is not blaming you for the exploitation you suffered. It is mapping the internal territory that needs to be worked on so the next instrumental favor does not produce the same result. Consciousness does not destroy generosity, it purifies it. You can be genuinely grateful and still evaluate what you are receiving. You can feel the obligation and still decide how and when to honor it. That space, between receiving and repaying, between obligation and the response to obligation, is where choice lives. Now the protocol, divided into two parts. First, how to read a favor before accepting, the signs that distinguish genuine generosity from strategic investment. Second, how to receive without indebting yourself beyond what you chose, and how to give without creating unwanted dependencies. There is a series of questions you can ask, internally, without declaring you are asking, when a favor arrives not as paranoia, as due diligence. Question 1. Does the timing make sense independently of me? A favor that arrives when you are under pressure, vulnerable, or about to make a decision that affects the giver deserves more analysis than a favor that arrives at a neutral time. Not proof of instrumentalization. Data that elevates attention, the concrete question. If I were not vulnerable now, if this moment did not exist, would this favor have arrived the same way? If the honest answer is probably not, the timing is not coincidence. And non-coincidental timing is the most reliable sign of a calculated favor. Question 2. Was the favor requested or imposed? There is a significant difference between a favor you asked for and a favor that arrived without you asking. A requested favor creates an obligation you consciously accepted when you made the request. An unsolicited favor creates an obligation placed on you without your participation in the decision. Instrumental favors are often unsolicited because an unsolicited favor arrives from above, from someone who had something to give, which you did not ask for, which you cannot refuse without appearing ungrateful. Unsolicited favors, especially when disproportionately large relative to the existing bond, deserve increased attention, not automatic suspicion, increased attention. Question 3. Is there a pattern of favors toward requests? One of the most sophisticated uses of reciprocity as a tool is not a single favor before a singular request. It is a sequence, a pattern of favors over time that gradually builds enough debt for a larger request. Small help, attention at the right moment, shared information, public defense, each small enough not to draw attention. The whole large enough to create an obligation justifying a significant request. The concrete question. When I look at the last 6 months, is there a pattern of favors from this person going in one specific direction? If the answer is yes, if the favors were consistent, directed, and never accompanied by equivalent requests, you may be in the middle of a debt construction. The request that will use that debt has not arrived yet. Question 4. How does the person react when you do not repay as expected? This is the most revealing question, and the only one that requires some action to answer. The genuine giver has no specific expectation of repayment. If you repay, they receive with grace. If you do not repay within the expected time or proportion, they continue. The bond does not change. The warmth does not diminish. The next favor arrives the same way. The instrumental giver has an expectation of repayment, even if never declared. When you do not repay within the time or proportion they calculated, something changes, the warmth cools slightly, availability decreases, favors stop arriving, the relationship acquires a tension that was not there before. That cooling, appearing precisely when you do not repay as expected, is the most concrete evidence that generosity had a price that was never declared. Part 2. Receiving without indebting. Identifying an instrumental favor is one thing. Knowing what to do next is another. And here there is a mistake most people make. After identifying a favor may be instrumental, they refuse in a way that signals they identified it. That is rarely the right answer, because refusing in a way that signals you saw reveals you were observing, which closes information doors and changes dynamics in a way that often costs more than the obligation the favor would create. The most effective protocol operates in 2 moves. Move 1. Accept with obligation neutralization. You can accept a favor and simultaneously reduce the obligation it creates through immediate proportional repayment. Not excessive repayment, which acknowledges the obligation and amplifies it. Immediate proportional repayment, which closes the transaction before the debt accumulates. Thank you so much for the help with the project. Let me invite you to lunch on Friday to compensate for the time you dedicated. You are not refusing the favor, not signaling suspicion. You are closing the account before it can be used. The genuine giver will receive this with grace, because closing the account does not change anything for them. The instrumental giver will experience mild discomfort, because the favor was given to create a debt that would be collected later, and you closed the debt before collection happened. You will not be able to identify the difference in the immediate response, but you will over time. Move 2. Disconnect the request from the favor when disproportionate. When the request that arrives after the favor is disproportionate, when what is being asked is clearly larger than what was given, the most effective response is not direct refusal. It is disconnecting the request from the favor. I understand you need this. Let me see what I can do, regardless of anything you may have done for me before. This sentence does 2 things simultaneously. First, signals you saw the connection between the favor and the request in a non-threatening way. Second, establishes that you will evaluate the request on its own merits, not the obligation created. Then you evaluate the request as you would any other request. If it makes sense, you meet it. If it does not, you refuse. And the refusal no longer carries the weight of unpaid debt. You disarmed the lever, without confrontation, without revealing you identified it, with one sentence. Protocol for giving without creating unwanted dependencies. A final observation on the other side. You also give favors, and favors given in a non-deliberate way can create dynamics you did not intend to create. 3 principles for giving without creating unwanted dependency. First, do not give what you cannot give without resentment. The favor given with resentment, given because you could not refuse, which cost more than you were willing to pay, creates an expectation of repayment you did not declare but that exists. An honest no is more generous than a resentful yes. Second, do not build patterns of favor you do not want to maintain. Repeated favors create expectations. The person you helped once may thank you. The person you helped 5 times starts expecting. If you do not want to create a continuing obligation, break the pattern early. Not with coldness, but with deliberate variation that communicates your availability is a choice, not a guarantee. Third, when possible, let the request come before the favor. The favor that arrives after the request is a response. The favor before the request is an investment, even when genuine. And in bonds where you genuinely want balance, where you want to be neither creditor nor debtor, waiting for the request before giving is one of the simplest ways to maintain that balance. There is a risk in everything said in this video, and I will name it before ending. The risk is that you leave here and start seeing every favor you receive as a trap, trait, every act of generosity as strategic investment, Close yourself off to receiving, because receiving now seems too risky. If that happens, this video failed, because the goal was never to create distrust. It was to create distinction. What this video really gave you. There is genuine generosity in the world. People who give because they have, who help because they care, who do favors without accounting, without expectation of return, without calculation of when they will collect. And those people who exist, who are likely part of your life, deserve to be received with openness. The problem is not generosity. It is the inability to distinguish between generosity and investment disguised as generosity. Because when you cannot distinguish, you have two bad options: open to everyone, and be exploited by those who use favors as leverage, or close to everyone, and lose the genuine connections that could exist. Calibrated distinction is the third option, the only one that leaves space for real connection. The Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote something that has stayed with me since the first time I read it. Hoc primum philosophia promitit, sensum communum, humanitatem et congregation. This is what philosophy promises first: common sense, humanity, and communion. Seneca was describing the goal of the well-lived life, not strategic isolation, but genuine communion. And genuine communion, the real connection between people who care and help each other without accounting, is only possible when you can distinguish it from the economy of obligations. You stop wasting vigilance on people who do not need vigilance, and you stop wasting openness on people who are using your openness as a resource. This is not cynicism. It is precision that frees generosity. There is a state Seneca described, and Jung would call individuation applied to relationship, the ability to give freely, without accounting, without expectation, without resentment, not because you ignored that favors create obligations, but because you chose to give from a place of sufficiency that does not need repayment to feel complete. That free generosity, rare, the goal. Not the starting point, but the arrival point of real psychological work. Is fundamentally different from the compulsive generosity we discussed in the script on the need to please. Compulsive generosity gives from fear, from need for approval, from inability to refuse. Free generosity gives from choice, because they can, because they want to, because the act of giving is sufficient in itself, regardless of return. And the difference between the two is not in the behavior. It is in what remains internally after giving. Compulsive generosity leaves a trace of expectation, of waiting for the return that was never declared, but exists. Free generosity leaves no trace. The favor was given. It is complete. What comes after is separate. You will receive a favor in the coming days. Small, large, and this time, not always, not in a paranoid way, but with the attention this video built, you will notice the timing, the proportion relative to the bond. Whether it was requested or imposed, whether there is a pattern of favors going in one specific direction, and you will ask a question, rarely asked in the moment a favor arrives. What am I receiving here? In reality, not as accusation, as awareness. And with awareness of what you are receiving, you will be able to decide what you want Toto with it. Whether to accept and create the obligation consciously. Whether to accept and close the account immediately, whether to gently refuse, and observe how the refusal is received. All of these are choices available to those who know what they are looking at. None of them are available to those who receive without seeing. Every favor creates an obligation. The question was never whether the obligation exists. The question is whether you assumed it with your eyes open. Subscribe, not for more content. For the ability to see, comment, what was the most expensive favor you ever received? Not in money, but in what it costs to repay. Share this with someone who keeps feeling obligated without understanding why. End.